my amazing Algebra 1 students. We're on lesson 7 now, and it is an interesting concept, but a very short lesson. So here we go. Talking about the opposite of a number. And when we're talking about the opposite of the number, it allows us to evaluate some very interesting expressions. What will we do with a negative 2? Or a negative 2? So we can stack these negatives, and we need to know how to deal with them. All right, so every time we see a negative, we can kind of think about it as an about face or an opposite of. So we could look at this one and say it's the opposite of a negative 2. Well, the opposite of a negative 2 would be a positive 2. Or we could say it's the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of negative 2. And of course, two opposites would end up going the same direction that you started in. Or we could look at it this way. If we were looking at this problem, we could start and say, oh, well, I know I start at 0, and I start to head in the negative direction because I have a negative sign. But then, oops, there's another negative sign. So I do an about face, and now I'm going to the right. But then as soon as I do that, I see another negative sign. Oops, I've got to go left again. So I turn my arrow to the left again, and I go 2 steps. And I wind up with negative 2, which is the correct answer. So we can look at it several different ways, but it does take a little bit of practice. Okay, this first little part of 7b has one of these very interesting problems here. We've got an opposite of negative 4. So negative and negative 4, it's easiest to read opposite of a negative 4. Well, we know the opposite of a negative 4 is a positive 4. Plus a negative 2. And then plus the opposite of a negative 6, which is a positive 6. So now every 2 signs is going to turn it around to a positive again. So now we end up with a positive 4 and a positive 6 is a positive 10, plus a negative 2 is going to make it a positive 8. So once we realize that each negative is in the opposite of, makes it a little bit easier to read. Let's see if we can unjumble this one. We have an opposite of a positive 4 would be a negative 4. Minus a negative 5, or the opposite of a negative 5 would be a positive 5. Plus another 5. Minus a negative 3 is going to be the opposite of a negative 3, which is a plus 3. Plus a negative 6. We'll just copy that down because it's already in a form we recognize. So now let's add all of our positive numbers. 5 plus 3 is 13. Plus, now let's add all of our negative numbers. Negative 4 plus negative 6 is negative 10. And we have our answer. Okay, so here's the next example, and we're going to simplify it some. So we have the opposite of a negative 3 is going to be a positive 3. And then we have a minus. So that's going to be the opposite of the negative 2. So this in here is a positive 2, and then the opposite of the positive 2 is a negative 2 again. So we'll just make that a plus a negative 2. And then we have a plus the opposite of a negative 3, which is a positive 3. So now when we add it all together, 3 plus 3 is 6, plus a negative 2 is going to be a 4. Okay, example 7.3. The opposite of a negative 4 is a positive 4. Plus a negative 2, which is already in the right form. And then we've got negative 6. Okay, so opposite of negative 6, the opposite of negative 6 is positive. And then we have another negative that's going to throw it negative. So it's going to be plus a negative 6. So Basically, the easy way to do this is stacked negatives. Two of them are going to make a positive. So we end up with one odd. So we had two that make a positive and one left over will make it a -6. So now we have two negative numbers and one positive number. Let's add our negatives together. Get a -8 and a +4. When we add opposite signs, we subtract and get a -4. Take the sign of the greater valued number here. This just looks messy, doesn't it? The opposite of a +4 is a -4. So let's just clean each one of these up. The opposite of a -5 is a +5. And then we have another +5. And the opposite of a -3 is a +3. And lastly, this one is written correctly. So now let's put our positives together. We got +13 plus a -10 is 3. Okay, here in practice problem A, now again, before you look at me do the problem, I want you to do both of these, A and B, on your own. So, pause your video and do A and B. Okay, so let's work on it together. Hopefully you already have the answer. The opposite of a -3 is a +3. And then the opposite of a -4 is a +4. So we end up with 7. Hopefully you got that on yours. This one is already written correctly. So we have a -5, which we would probably not put the plus in front of that, and then plus a +6 because there's two negatives stacked there. The opposite of a -6 is a +6. Opposite signs subtract. 6 minus 5 is 1. Take the sign of the greater valued so it stays positive. Hopefully you got those two answers. Okay, this one is not written correctly. The opposite of a +6 is a -6. So let's go ahead and simplify each one of these. The opposite of a -8 is a +8, plus the 7. The opposite of a -3 is a +3. And then this one is already written correctly. So now let's look at all of our positives. 3 plus 7 plus 8 is 18 positive, plus our two negatives add together to give us -11. 18 plus -11, opposite sign subtract. Take the sign of the greater valued number. So +7 is our answer. Okay, here's our last example. But we can simplify the opposite of -3 to a +3. And the opposite of an opposite of an opposite of -4, opposite of 4, is going to end up being -4 because there are two that we can turn into a positive, so it winds up being one negative sign. And then the opposite of a -6 is a +6. So then the two positives add to 9 plus the -4. And since they're opposite signs, we subtract and take the sign of the greater. So our answer is 5. That is the end of lesson 7. And this is Mrs. A. And may God bless your day.